surprised Larry and me and Charles by also taking out a recorder and putting it on the table, and I gave him a look. And he said, hey, machines fail, your batteries may die, I thought you guys might want a backup. We all agreed that was good. On those 3 occasions, I turned off my recorder. After it was all done, we go our separate ways. Larry and I and Bob walk out to the parking lot, and this never appeared in the book. And until the conference in England last month, no one has ever known about this outside of myself and Larry and Bob and a small circle of friends. And I mentioned it last night for the first time, and I'm going to tell you. I said something to the effect of, wow, wasn't that amazing, you know, what Charles told us off the record. And sure wish that we could put that, you know, that was on the tape. And Bob gave me a look and he said, I didn't turn off my recorder. To tell you, give you an idea of what kind of Boy Scout I was at the time, I was quietly irate. How dare you do that? And he said, look, I was looking at you guys. You were really engaged. You were looking in each other's eyes. When you turned off your recorder, I touched the button. But all you had to do was look down at my recorder and you would have seen the tape spinning through the plastic. So that tape exists of the things that Charles said off the record, which you're going to know shortly. Or you know already if you've read Left@Escape, because they're at the end of Left@Escape. But I was really disappointed in Bob. In a way, I wish I had done it, but I dedicated myself to being an ethical person. And Bob and I, we really never saw each other. Saw each other once at a conference a year or so later, but that was it. And then a few years after that, Bob felt the UFO community had really betrayed him. And he gave a final talk and blasted the community, walked away from ufology forever, and that was that. You can find that talk on YouTube. And in 2008, something happened that made me feel, I want to contact him and see if I can get that tape, and it was this. Bob Hastings' very fine book was published on UFOs and nukes. And I never actually read it. I'm reading it right now. But I found out last year that in the book, the following exchange happens. It includes a wide-ranging interview with Charles Halt, who of course was involved in a legitimate UFO nuke event. And Hastings did a very good job, I must say, of this is the best compendium of UFO nuclear-related events ever published. And Bob is a very serious, very pragmatic, very honest man. Anyway, there is no ambiguity in what Colonel Halt said at a point. And I was very glad he put it on the record the way he did. And this here, I'm quoting Robert Hastings from his fine book, quote, according to Halt, he saw the object direct laser-like beams of light onto various parts of the base while simultaneously listening to the radio chatter from security personnel indicating that some of the beams fell within or near the weapons complex. Again, this is the nuclear weapons storage complex. But following this portion of this interview with Hastings, Halt decided to expand on these remarks, and I quote him here. He simply just said the following. He wasn't asked, he just said it. I never told Left@Escape author Peter Robins any structure was penetrated by beams. I was several miles away. From my view, a beam or more came down near the WSA. I don't know for a fact that the beams landed there. I know they were in the area. I was too far away, but relied on the radio chatter which indicated the beams landed there. The objects in the sky came from the east and moved west, skirting Woodbridge and approaching Bentwaters. When beams came down, the objects were closer to the Bentwaters WSA, just to the north of the facility. I never told Left@Escape author Peter Robins any structure was penetrated by beams. Now, sometime after Charles retired from the service, he received his first invitation to speak at a UFO conference, and it happened to be in England. And after it was over, and you all know the dynamics, you hear a talk that you find particularly compelling, it's over, there's a quiet moment, you go up to the speaker, nice talk, thank you very much, I've got a question for you, what have you. And a few guys were there, and one of them said, what about Larry's involvement? He said Larry wasn't involved, he's a wannabe. What he didn't know was that the guy who asked the question was a friend of Larry's of mine. And shortly after, he called me up and he said, you should know this. And I hit the ceiling. I was furious. I was angry. I was disgusted. He had as much as told us that he couldn't say that Larry wasn't there, and now he's saying he wasn't there. And I thought, you know what, the hell with you. I'm putting this on the record. And what I'm going to do now is read you part of the conclusions and ending of Left at East Gate. I devote a page or two in cases to certain things that were discussed in this 540-page book, and this is one of them. So, this is me quoting myself. Good writer. Charles Halt. In December 1980, Deputy Base Commander Lieutenant Charles I. Halt was an Air Force career officer serving his country with distinction. Being identified as the highest-ranking officer to witness any of the events, as well as the author of what is still the only authentic document to surface on them, was undoubtedly the worst thing that had happened in his military career. By 1991, when he retired as a full colonel, Halt had taken more Bentwaters heat than any other officer in the Air Force. It is my belief that during the incidents themselves and the aftermath and ever since, he had continued to serve in the Air Force with distinction than any of us will ever be able to appreciate. I respect Halt, admire his sense of loyalty, and only wish him the best in life. However, I cannot and will not condone certain things he has said about my co-author. They're just not correct. Let me backtrack. As I understood it, the Air Force documents Halt had referred to in our phone conversations came to him via a Pentagon contact. It is clear in the transcripts that he had no doubts about their validity, and if Larry and I could get down to meet him, he would show them to us. We had been looking forward to seeing these papers, but we never did. I think the reason was that at some point during our talk, perhaps after reading those through some of Larry's service documents, which we brought and provided him copies of, Halt realized there could have been a problem with his own papers. My feeling is that they were Pentagon-generated disinformation designed without Halt's knowledge to make him believe that Warren could not have been posted on D Flight or any other flight on the night in question, thus reinforcing his belief that Warren was not telling the truth. I'm not sure what Larry or Bob Exler made of it at the time, but the impression was real enough for me, and I chose not to press the issue. I am convinced that the lion's share of the information that Halt did share with us was the truth as he knew or suspected it to be. Some key points of what he told us are worth reviewing. More than one thing happened. The real story was what happened afterwards, not what happened there. Larry had been meddled with, but it was not an experiment. The Bentwaters security logs and blotter for the nights in question had disappeared. Larry and I had no clear idea of what we had gotten ourselves into or how deep in we were. We should assume our phone lines were dirty and be as concerned about our health and well-being as he was about his. He told us several other things, but not before asking me to turn off the recorder. I complied with each request. Although he did not say, "I am telling you this in confidence," that was what I understood him to mean. In July 1994, Halt returned to England and addressed a UFO conference in Manchester. Sometime during that weekend, he was speaking informally with a group of audience members when one of them asked a question about Larry Warren. Larry was not there, came the answer. His account was untrue. If anything was not true here, it was the Colonel's answer. A year and a half earlier, Halt said to Warren, quote, "I think you sincerely believe what you're saying, and you may be right, and I can't say you're lying, but I find flaws here and there, and I have to resolve them for myself." Yes, it is true. Maybe Larry only believed what he was saying, and that was the extent of it. And yes, I have felt the same compulsion Halt did, to find the flaws and resolve them. But the fact is that Halt knows that what Larry is saying may be correct. I never served in the military, but I have grown to appreciate the code of many who have served by, I think, Halt, that like many retired career officers continue to adhere to the standards of that code in civilian life. I can only commend him for it. But I live by a code too, and Halt broke it when he answered the question in Manchester. We know he made the remarks because a researcher friend of ours asked the question. No, we hadn't asked him to. There are also two other people in the group who had heard Larry and me several months earlier in Nottingham. The pair never spoke with our researcher friend, but all contacted us with the same news shortly afterward. For me, Halt's response was the equivalent of breaking a confidence. That is why I have decided to break the confidence that was implied when Halt asked me to turn off my tape recorder. He told us three things. One, he was very much aware of the NSA's interest in Larry. He had personally attempted to gain access to Larry's military record without success. Light beams had penetrated the hardened bunkers of Bentwater's security area, that it was and is plenty. I hope Halt understands why I have taken this action. Larry wanted to do it himself, but his doing it might have appeared personally based. That is, and it is not a personal matter. I agree with Larry's conclusions as to why a retired officer would not be free to speak openly, as in this case a former airman might. As such, I do not expect Halt will ever be able to comment publicly about the nuclear weapons at Bentwaters. As to concerns for our safety, I am convinced that publishing the facts herein will only lessen the chances of harm to the Colonel, myself, and Larry. Unless I'm mistaken, quite a few of our readers will be taking an inordinate interest in the health and well-being of all three of us. I think that disclosure will be our best insurance. End quoting myself. Now, what Halt had actually said in terms of his actual wording was that the beams of light had somehow penetrated down through the hardened bunkers and quote-unquote adversely affected the ordnance. That is a very memorable phrase, and it stuck in my mind. And in August of 1997, when Jim Martin interviewed me for the terrific interview he did in Flatland magazine, he was so impressed by that statement that he used it as a title. Now, I ask you, at this moment in time, I am riding high. I have a bestseller in the United Kingdom. I'm all over the place. I'm actually making a little bit of money. I'm proud of the fact that we have accomplished what we have. What could possibly compel me to make up a fabrication like this and go on record in an obscure publication that wasn't even UFO related and jeopardize all of our good work? Now, you now know that Bob Exler, and that is spelled O-E-C-H-S-L-E-R, who is on Facebook, who is on LinkedIn, has that tape. Maybe one of you can make contact with him. Maybe one of you can buy it from him or get him to release it in the public interest. What I will tell you here is that I'm telling you the truth and that Charles Halt is not. And I stand ready at any given point to be polygraphed, to be voice stress analyzed, and Larry does too. And if Charles would be happy to do that, I think we could settle this matter fairly quickly. Okay, in July of 2009, I was working as a consultant for the city of Roswell, New Mexico. Following their annual July conference, I was spending some time with my friend Pat Corrigan, and that's C-O-R-R-I-G-A-N, if any of you want to find Pat and ask him about this. Earlier that year, this year, Pat made a career change, but up until earlier this year, he had spent 10 years as a corrections officer at the prison outside of Roswell, New Mexico. He's an honorable and decent man, but in 1980, he was a nuclear weapons specialist stationed at RAF Bentwaters by chance. Wow. And he knew in passing John, he knew in passing Colonel Halt, but 5 months before the events in question, he was transferred out of Bentwaters and back to the States. End of that part of the story. We were sitting in his car talking about this, that, and the other thing, and my cell phone rang. I called Pat about a week ago to make sure he remembered the call, and he did. It was John Burroughs on the phone. I remembered in part because of the content, and in part because it's the only time I ever received a phone call in my life from John. The gist of the call was that I know we've had our differences, but I wanted to tell you, number one, that I'm moving heaven and earth to try to create a 30th anniversary reunion for men who were involved in the Rendlesham Forest. And I'm doing things you couldn't possibly do, like reach out to guys in alumni websites and things. And I said, John, you can count on me in any way possible. If there's anything I can do to help with this event, I hope you'll include everybody, including Charles and Jim and Larry, and said, yeah, I'm going to try. And he said, I also have to tell you that, and I'm speaking from memory, ladies and gentlemen, the gist of it was, I have had it with Charles Halt. He has played me, he has used me, he has misled me. We had an argument about the landing site. I said it was here, along with Jim. He said no, it was here. And I just wanted you to know that's the way I felt. I'm going to be sending you some emails. Let's stay in touch. Boom. Anyway, the following, well, in the weeks that followed, I received several really interesting emails from him. And they were, it was obvious to me from the emails that the guy was putting his heart and tremendous effort into a search for answers and efforts to get the witnesses together for some kind of 30th anniversary event in December 2010. I, of course, told Larry about my exchange with John, and he was as much on John's side as I was. One of the emails he sent me was a history of one of the officers who was involved in law enforcement stationed on Bentwaters, and that was Malcolm Ziegler, and how he went on to a career in military intelligence. Another was a very interesting piece on Chuck DeCaro, the CNN investigative reporter who fleshed out the case and reported on it for CNN in a series of special reports in 1984. DeCaro was as good as they get, and he caught the Air Force in 16 lies out of 20 questions he had submitted. As a result, his career as a military reporter suffered, and it took quite a number of years for him to get back up to speed. Now, I have copies of these, etc. But John impressed me most with the email he sent to Charles Halt on July 7th, 2009. Prior to reading it, I had no way of knowing that despite his public face of overall solidarity with his former deputy base commander, there were frustrations about Halt's truthfulness, not unlike Larry's, and anger toward Charles for some other very good reasons. With all due respect to John, I am putting that email on the public record right now. John never said, don't share this, don't send it, but I simply filed it and kind of forced myself in part to forget about it. But I can no longer do that. This is the text. And what I may do is just drop out a few points that have absolutely nothing to do with this, because I realized it was running long when I read it yesterday into the record for the very first time in my life. Wednesday, July 8th, 2009. Okay, Colonel, let's see if you will answer some simple questions I have. First of all, Ben Jamerson, a researcher who lives in New York State, has a copy of your tape that he copied off the original, plus paperwork and a recorded interview he did with you that we would like to use. We have an agreement. He has an agreement with you saying, and when he says we, he's referring to a British UFO researcher named Gary Hazeltine. Gary, as some of you know, and that's John speaking at the 30th anniversary conference, which he unfortunately was not able to organize, but which a group of us were able to put together in the UK, December 28th, 2010. Gary Hazeltine was a British military police officer. He is now finishing up a career as a police detective in Yorkshire. He's become a Rendlesham scholar, and he gave a great paper last month on a forensic report from a cop's point of view on the evidence regarding Rendlesham. And he is working on a screenplay about Bentwaters with Charles Halt. So John is referring to him here. He has an agreement with you saying he needs your permission to use it. Will you allow that information to be used? On the tape itself, both you and Colonel Morgan claim to have the original tape. Who has the original tape? General Williams, who claims to have no knowledge of the incident or even the fact you wrote the memo, had Colonel Morgan make a copy of the original tape and give it to Georgina Bruni. Colonel Morgan's original email to me started with wanting to know what organization was behind the 30th year Rendlesham reunion I'm trying to put together. There was no organization, it was just John. On the reunion, I have been in contact with Gary Hazeltine on the movie you guys are putting together and truly hope the project will happen. I asked him if you and him would like to be involved with the reunion, and his response was that he would be happy to help if he could. So I'm asking you now, would you like to be involved in the reunion? Over the years, I have been told you have tried to keep me out of different shows about Bentwaters, i.e. the ABC, Sci-Fi, and History Channel productions. I was told by them, you told them, You had no idea how to get a hold of me, yet you were working with Jim Peniston, who had my email address and could get a hold of me and did pass it on. On Out of the Blue, many of you are familiar with that terrific documentary that James Fox did. On Out of the Blue, with Mr. Fox, you told him I was lying about being out with you on the third night. When I got started, when I first stated saying I was out there with you, you said I never was involved at all on the third night. Well, your tape proves that I was. You then said I never went forward and met with you, but I have an interview with you stating I did come forward and met with you with your group. I have been told that your reasoning was that I was a loose cannon and would talk too much to the press about the incident. Well, you just did a press release saying that whatever you saw was ET in nature. What could I have said that would have caused more of a stir than that? How do you know for sure it was ET? I have been told by more than one person who was involved in the command structure that there was no investigation done afterwards, which I don't believe. The part about Colonel Morgan that is very interesting is that he released your tape and claims to still have the original copy of it. He will not support anything you are saying on the record, to include that you have the original copy of the tape you made. Colonel Williams says he knew nothing about the incident and would not support anything you said, to include your memo, saying he would never have allowed it to be sent to the British. Yet he knew that Colonel Morgan had the original tape you made and had made make a copy of it and give it to Georgina Bruni. Then there is Colonel Conrad, who was the base commander, Charles Hart's boss, who was the base commander at the time and moved on to vice wing commander afterwards, stating he never saw anything from the house like you claim and has given no support to your claims. After being asked for certain questions, that's about Ziegler, and it does not really bear on this. Okay. You yourself have stated he ran a major investigation, that's Ziegler, afterwards involving OSI, that's Air Force Office of Special Investigation. Yet I can find no one who will give support, who will support that. On the question of the paper trail of reports 1564, the blotters stated that the blotters stated, sorry, 1564 and blotters, you stated they were stolen. Well, everybody who worked back at the area stated they were not, and that they were available and maintained in a proper way and kept in storage and required amount of time. Everybody agrees if they came up missing, there would have been a major investigation done because they were controlled items. The fact that nobody in my chain of command can agree is very interesting. Plus, that a squadron commander seems to run the show is even more interesting. After he departed Bentwaters, moved on to Eglin Air Force Base, Florida, where there were more reported numerous UFO events. He, that is Ziegler, then moved on to become head of security for GE Aerospace, blah, blah, blah. This is just a few things I've uncovered, Colonel Halt, and would welcome your response to exclamation point. I would truly like for all of us to be able to get together next year and would welcome your involvement in the reunion. Thanks, John Burroughs. I'm about to read to you Charles Halt's response from later that day. John, I'd be interested in hearing what you learned. Ziegler's involvement is no surprise. Charles, end of communication. Can we take a moment and give a round of applause to John Burroughs? On Monday, August 3rd, John followed up with an email to Gary Hazeltine, underscoring the thoughts he had expressed to Charles Halt and adding some new information. Again, with all due respect to John, his insightful questions to Hazeltine, a still-serving British police detective who has partnered with Halt in screen treatment of the Rendlesham incident, and is too important and pertinent to me to keep filed away any longer. In the words of Watergate impeachment hearings, Judge John Sirica, let the chips fall where they may. Monday, August 3rd, 2009. Gary, I just listened to your interview with Linda and it was well done. I have a couple of questions for you. Halt stated on the third night he went out into the forest to do an investigation. So prior to the third night, he or no one else from the senior command went out to see what happened? How did he find the site we were at the first night? Nobody on duty was there or would have known where it was. How could he have never been brought in and questioned? He wrote a memo which was approved, according to him, by Williams and sent to the British. So it was handed over to the British to look at, and no one from our government talking to Halt or Williams about it? No one from security, i.e. OSI, was brought in to talk to Halt about it, but they brought all of us in and interrogated us? General Gabriel came down and was briefed on it. Williams went over and talked to his bosses about it at 3rd Air Force and was told to give it to the British to deal with, again, without Halt being questioned on what happened. So we have an incident that happened in another country that no one is sure about what it was or what to do with it, and the man who was out in the field, in the forest, referring to Halt, was not brought in and questioned and was allowed to see a memo to another government. Something does not add up here. Early last year, Paul Eno, an American broadcaster with CBS with a terrific show, some of you may listen to it, he does it with his son. Paul, who has followed this story for several decades, did something remarkable. He was able to bring a lot of us together for a series of radio shows that we called the Rendlesham Roundtable. And from, I believe, about April of 2010 until about November, missing 1 month, every month there was a 2-hour show. The first show included John, Jim, Charles, Larry, myself, and Nick Pope, as I recall. And then there were combinations including Linda, possibly Hazeltine, etc. And on that show, Halt acknowledged, I don't have the wording here because I didn't re-listen to the archive piece. I'm 97 sure, Halt admitted, yes, you were involved, to Larry. I ended the show by saying to Charles, essentially, look, I know, we all know, that Larry's releasing that information to Larry Fawcett did not help your career. It caused you personal and a certain amount of professional problems. I am sorry for that. I feel you hold animus about that. Can we get on with things? He never answered. We cut to commercial. The show was over. Okay. Okay. At the conference itself, Nick Pope, who is not a speaker, this is the Bentwaters flight line here, and as one of the many wonderful Suffolk headlines from after Left at East Gate came out, and this was a big feature headline in the local paper relative to where this happened, and it was a 2-page spread featuring 4 photographs, Scully and Mulder and Robbins and Warren. And you can bet Larry and I had quite a fight about who was going to be Scully and who was going to be Mulder. I don't remember who won. It was not pretty. This is part of that conference, which was incredibly intense and very emotional. And that's Jim off to the side there. And that's Nick in the wings, watching Jim there. Nick, who was not a speaker but did participate in the Q&A and panel discussion. Jim and John began their talk standing together on the stage with handheld mics. At one point they acknowledged Larry for his pioneering involvement, but caught a number of us off guard with their extended negative comments about their former deputy base commander. Working from memory here, of course, but as I recall, Peniston claimed that Colonel Halt was working with the AFOSI, insisted that the landing location was not where they remembered it to be, and it was Halt who kept the witnesses apart. I will have to confirm these memories by watching the video itself. You can too, but they certainly were incredibly critical about Charles Halt. At one point during the conference, I was backstage in the green room with Jim. It was there he told me that he had read Left at East Gate and then, quote, "It was not bad." Not a compliment, but in the context of the moment, it actually sounded pretty good to me. You would have had to have been there. However, there's Jim, and that's me, that's Larry over there, that's our friend Dell, and the guy on the right is a good man who lives, I think, in Norfolk, Ronnie Dugdale, a local investigator, and just one of the great guys. Sometime after Jim told this to me, he told Ronnie, a good friend of Larry's and mine, who had been a friend of Jim's, but who estranged Ronnie, that he had not read our book, which is true, I don't know. Okay, this is a part I've decided not to include. Okay, the beautiful Arizona desert. Now, To the best of my knowledge, Charles never reacted to the allegations Jim and John made in December of 2010, certainly not publicly. But a scant 2.5 months later, and some of you were witness to this, in Phoenix, perhaps some of you heard the presentation by a complete fluke. I was actually in Phoenix at the time, across town on completely separate business that disallowed me from even visiting the conference except for once to have dinner with friends. I learned that day from a call from a friend who was listening to Charles Halt's talk that Peniston had said, I'm working with Halt, nothing more to do with Linda, and John, I don't know if he made a statement, but something does not add up here, to quote John. Now, last year, this year, a few months ago in February, I spoke at the UFO Congress. Some of you heard my remembrance of Bud Hopkins. And I have to tell you, 2 people over the 4 days of the conference got me aside and said, I wanted to just share something with you that you should be aware of. I am as convinced as I can be neither of these people knew each other. They had nothing to gain from the simple thing they told me. It was just passing along from information. One of them said, well, many of you know the complex. You know that there's an Italian restaurant attached to it, and there's sort of a law of dynamics in conference centers. You have one snooty-looking, overly decorated restaurant that charges twice what it should for extremely mediocre food. This is that restaurant. I don't think they're going to want me to write them a review. But he said, I was outside, and I looked, and I saw seated in a window seat Halt and Peniston. And Peniston was furious. His face was filled with anger. He was gesturing tremendously, and Halt sat there like a statue. Another person a day or 2 later said, something I want to share with you. I was waiting to be seated. I looked because I saw some movement off to the side, and I saw Jim Peniston and the back of a head that I later learned was Charles Halt. And Jim was gesturing tremendously. I couldn't even see him, but he was angry as hell, and I didn't see any movement from Halt. I have since learned from another person who has nothing to gain from this, that in that same day, she saw Halt and Linda having an argument with John and Jim standing by Halt, very quietly saying nothing. Halt saying, you're wrong, that's not correct, it's not correct. Linda saying, my source says it was, I believe it, etc. What in the name of God happened between December and February to make John and Jim seem to come completely around again? I don't know. I do know that 3 weeks later, for the very first time, Charles Halt and I were speaking at the same conference in Lawrence, Kansas. I also know, and it made me a little anxious when I found out, that a few weeks after I'd been invited to speak, I received a phone call from the organizer saying, listen, just want to give you a heads up on something. Charles Halt just called me to say, I don't know how arranging the speakers, but I want to go after Peter Robins. I thought, this can't be good. And if I wanted to respond to something that I had since learned that he said during his talk, I guess I'll have to do it in advance. And what that was during his talk, he made some remarks about Larry Warren. And the remarks are captured on his presentation. And we're about to hear that clip.
Something very strange. Now, there's a lot of disinformation out there. The young man has written a book. I think you know who it is. He worked with Peter Robins. I'm firmly convinced, and Jim and John are firmly convinced, that he was not there. That he took Adrian Bustinza, who was a good friend's story, embellished it. Because he talks about little green men. He talks about the avionics shop providing parts to repair this damaged craft. He talks about Gordon Williams being there, and we know Gordon Williams wasn't there. Gordon Williams couldn't have been there. Several reasons. Number one, the senior officer on the base has to maintain total, complete contact with the command post at all times. That doesn't mean talking to them, but anytime he leaves his quarters and goes away from that hardline phone, he has to call on the radio and say, I am going to the officers club, I am going here to make a presentation, etc., etc., etc. So I know for a fact, because my radio never went off, Gordon Williams never left his house that night. So we know he didn't leave the house. I talked to Larry Fawcett. Now remember I mentioned Larry Fawcett earlier? Larry Fawcett's the guy that forced out the documents. Larry Fawcett was working with this young man working on a book. I know that because Larry called me a half a dozen times. And finally Larry called me and says, too many inconsistencies, the guy doesn't know what he's talking about. I'm firmly convinced